This is Science Friday. I'm Ira Flato. Perhaps you've heard the news by now. There is life on the moon. Just so happens to be caused by an accident. Back in April, the Israeli aerospace company SpaceIL was all set to land the first private spacecraft on the moon. But minutes before touchdown, the lunar lander crashed, spilling its payload onto the moon's surface, which included those very hardy, tiny tardigrades. Here to tell us about how we got there, what the first water bears on the moon mean, and to give us the rundown of other short subjects in science, science journalist Eleanor Cummins. Welcome to Science Friday.
Thanks so much for having me.
So how did we get lunar invasion of tardigrades?
Right. So as you said, back in April, SpaceIL accidentally crashed their lander on the moon. Their main payload was human knowledge. They were bringing things like books and Wikipedia pages, but they also had this sort of surprise payload, these tardigrades. So as you may remember, tardigrades are these really incredible micro animals. They have 8 legs and segmented bodies, and they seem to survive like literally anything. We found them at very low pressure, at very high pressure, in extreme heat and extreme cold. They've even been to space before, and some of them lived. So they're pretty incredible animals, and now they seem to be on the surface of the moon.
So the $64 question, could it be that these tardigrades are still alive or in hibernation somehow?
So the tardigrades were sent up dehydrated. They have this ability to sort of shrivel up and effectively turn into glass at a cellular level, and so that's how they were delivered to the moon. It is entirely possible that they are still alive. We've been able to rehydrate tardigrades after years in a dehydrated state. So if anyone ever gets the chance to do that, they may spring back to life.
Wow. So they're not going to bring them back, are they?
I don't think they have any plans to go back and get them.
This is kind of cool stuff. But the whole policy is, in space exploration, is trying not to litter other planets with our biome or anything that we bring up there. But that's been broken years ago, hasn't it?
Yeah, this was totally legal for them to do, which may be surprising to a lot of people. NASA classifies these celestial bodies according to the priority of concern for contamination. So on Mars, we think that it may have the potential to have its own life, and it could hold other life in the future. So we have to be really careful about what we bring there. But the moon, we're pretty sure, doesn't have any of its own life and probably couldn't harbor any other life. So it's kind of a free-for-all. These tardigrades are definitely not alone. They're up there with a lot of Apollo 11 poop, among other biological matter.
Yeah, that's been talked about a lot. The 50th anniversary, never mind, we won't go there. Something almost as wild is that there's some news floating around the internet about feral hogs this week.
Yeah, so this was a viral Twitter sensation. Basically, a guy responded to a sort of politically charged tweet about gun control with a question asking how he could kill, quote, 30 to 50 feral hogs that were reportedly running amok on his property and scaring his children. And it became this meme where people were quoting 30 to 50 feral hogs and putting all of these, videos together. But it's actually a really serious issue. In the United States right now, there are an estimated 7 million of these feral hogs in 35 states. They're concentrated in the southeast. While they don't really like interacting with humans, they're definitely dangerous, but worst of all, they're ecologically disastrous. They will eat anything they can get to, and they like to root up plants, so they'll just totally clear out an agricultural area or wildlife.
Wow. Is there a problem, the danger they might spread everywhere or go all over the place?
They're already pretty much everywhere. Basically, back in the 1500s, colonists started bringing over domesticated pigs. And then in the 1900s, game hunters started stalking wild boar. And those two animals combined into these wild feral pigs that we have all over the U.S. today. They've been spotted throughout the lower 48, and they are posing a really big problem, which is why the U.S. Department of Agriculture wants to go after them.
So these hogs are not indigenous to the United States?
No, not at all.
They're brought over by European settlers, and where are they mostly now concentrated?
They're in the southeast, and that's where people really like to hunt them. So in Texas, for example, people go out and hunt about 30,000 of these hogs every year, which sounds like a big number until you consider that Texas has an estimated 2 million of these animals running around.
Wow. And so is there any program to try to round them up or to take care of them somehow.
Yeah, so earlier this year, the U.S. Department of Agriculture decided to fund a pilot program to sort of figure out how they could contain them. And they're trying a bunch of different strategies. One is to take helicopters out, locate a group of feral hogs, and then shoot them all down. Another is called the Judas pig strategy, which is where if you find a loner pig, you strap a GPS device to its body, and then when it returns to its group, the proverbial 30 to 50 feral hogs, you can track them all down and kill them.
So there's a mass hunt going on.
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, let's move up to something different. Scientists are taking a second look at some dinosaur bones from South Africa. We're always interested in dinosaur bones.
Yeah, so this is really exciting. Back in 1978, some scientists classified a bunch of bones as Massos pondylus, which is a really common dinosaur in southern Africa. They were like 20 feet tall, mostly herbivores, very cool. But British scientists were recently re-looking through those museum collections, and they thought something was kind of off. They found this one skeleton, a skull specifically, that was really boxy and compressed, whereas Massos pondylus tends to have a sort of elongated skull. And they were like, we need to look into this. And in a new paper, they determined that it's actually a new species, which is called Nguervu intloco, which in the local Xhosa language means gray skull. So a new species just hiding in plain sight.
Wow. We know the fossil record, it gets re-examined all the time. What is so special about this case? So
the really exciting thing is that this actually is not only a new species, but they think it's a new genus. And what that means, as you probably remember, a genus is a higher order of taxonomy. And so it means that there could be more species underneath this genus, just like Nguervu intloco. So now they're trying to reconsider a bunch of different pieces of Massos pondylus and wondering if these might be reclassified as an entirely new kind of dinosaur.
Wow, that is kind of exciting and unusual, isn't it?
Definitely.
Yeah. Moving on. There was a really sobering study out this week that showed that more than 1,500 people have been killed in the last 15 years for defending their environment. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this was definitely, I think, surprising to a lot of people and very troubling. So a new study in Nature Sustainability reports that between 2002 and 2017, an estimated 1,500 plus people were killed for defending their environment. So that means trying to stop things like dams or logging and defending natural resources. And that's actually more in that same time period than the number of service members from the United Kingdom and Australia who were killed abroad in war zones in the same period, which means that environmental advocacy is more dangerous than anyone really thought.
Give us some details on this. Who are these people? Why is it so dangerous? What were they defending?
So the people involved are actually really widely varied. Many of them are activists, but there have also been killings of journalists and lawyers who have been involved in environmental issues. It really seems like in some areas, if you go up against the wrong people, no matter in what capacity, you put yourself at a risk. So it is something where you're most at risk in countries that have sort of corruption or weak government. It's highest in Central and South America. That's where the most people have been murdered. And it's not, just these people on the picket lines. It's really anyone involved in any capacity. And they're often killed, unfortunately, by the people who are doing the extraction. So miners, loggers, and sometimes even the police and military are involved in these crimes.
So we're talking about advocates then, like lawyers and journalists, as you say, people who are standing up for the environment.
Right. So Berta Caceres is a really great example of this, unfortunately. So she was an indigenous Honduran activist, and she tried to stop a dam on sacred land. And she was brutally murdered by hitmen who were actually hired by the dam company because they felt that she was causing, too many delays in their project timelines.
Mm-hmm. And so what might be, how can we mitigate this? What can researchers do, or what can they suggest be done?
So the suggestion here was basically that companies and countries have to be held accountable. So they found that only 10% of cases are actually pursued by the court, which is an extremely low percentage. And so basically people who carry out these crimes feel a sense of impunity. They know that they're not really going to be pursued for what they've done. So, creating an example of if you kill an environmental activist, you are going to be taken to court is what these authors were recommending in their paper.
There is one of my favorite meteor showers coming up. Comes up every August. It's a great one. Coming back next week. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Perseids are back. So they come around every year. They're one of the most beautiful and prolific meteor showers in the Northern Hemisphere. It's really exciting. They're going to be peaking on Monday, August 12th and Tuesday, August 13th. So you should definitely get some coffee, stay up late, and head out to a place with low light pollution because the show is on.
And this is kind of a fun event to have. Have you ever gone out and done this? This is really a fun thing to do. You go outside, you can lie down on the top of your car, the hood of your car, or you can get a chaise lounge out, lie down in the on your back and watch the sky. It's fun. It's the right kind of temperature and everything.
Yeah, the temperature is going to be perfect for it in a lot of the Northern Hemisphere. And you just have to make sure that you give yourself time for your eyes to adjust because it definitely is difficult to look into that dark sky and see things. So give it about an hour, and then you should be in for a really good show.
And of course, it's always a great time to look at the planets. You can see some great views of Jupiter and Saturn now. And speaking of the planets, I want to bring in one more bit of space news. Scientists think they found evidence of a tsunami on Mars. Is that right?
So yeah, we all know what the Mars looks like today. It's red and dusty. But scientists have been debating for a really long time what it looked like about 4 billion years ago. So some think that there was once a giant ocean, and others think that it's always been a pretty icy place in the Northern Hemisphere. But the people who think that there was an open body of water just got a big boost because scientists have identified a 75-mile wide impact crater that looks a lot like the one in the Yucatan on Earth that triggered the extinction of the dinosaurs.
Wow.
And so they're saying this looks like it crashed into an ocean and kind of reshaped the surface of the planet.
Well, that is exciting. Thank you, Eleanor. Great stuff. Eleanor Cummins, science journalist based in New York. Thanks again. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're hopping on board an icebreaker in the Arctic to study summers in that rapidly warming region. We'll be right back with the trip to the Arctic. Stay with us. We'll cool off. This is Science Friday. I'm Ira Flato. The Northwest Passage, that Arctic icy shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It's always fascinated people. Inuit communities in the area have traveled the waterway for millennia. Remember your explorers, John Cabot, Henry Hudson? They set sail for these frigid waters, looking for new trade routes. And now you can even take a vacation cruise through it. But one of the latest expeditions to the Northwest Passage had a different mission: to study the science of the rapidly warming Arctic. Last month, a team of oceanographers, marine biologists, ice experts, and students boarded the Odin, an icebreaker boat, and began an 18-day expedition through the passage. Now, last year, if you remember, the team launched, but they were grounded one day into the journey. They had to cut the trip short. But this time, the expedition made it all the way from Greenland, along the northern coast of Canada, through the Barrow Strait, and out to Melville Sound by the Arctic Ocean. Team returned to Greenland this week with lots of observations and a lost buoy they recovered that holds a year's worth of whale songs. We're going to talk about some of that, all of that. My guests are here to take us through that expedition. Bryce Luce is the chief scientist of the Northwest Passage Project, associate professor of oceanography at the University of Rhode Island in South Kingston, Rhode Island. Welcome to Science Friday.
Hi, Ira. Thank you. It's great to be back just about a year later.
And Holly Morin is a marine biologist and education specialist also at the University of Rhode Island. Welcome, Holly.
Hi, Ira. Thanks so much for having us today.
Yeah, it was nice to have you. I'm glad you had a successful trip this time. Last a little longer than last time. And in your last visit, we talked to you last year right after the boat ran aground. What's challenging about navigating through the Northwest Passage, even on an icebreaker boat, Bryce?
So I'd say the challenges are the same as they were last year. Invariably, you encounter ice conditions that are probably not optimal for navigating. And even with an icebreaker, especially in an environment like that, the captain gets nervous because you're having to navigate through ice which is being pushed around by the wind, but then you've got some really narrow shorelines. And so the captain's nightmare scenario, the boat is being pushed by the ice and it's eventually drifting towards the shore or into shallow water. And all these are the factors that they kind of take into account when they figure out where we can go and what we can do. In that regard, we did have some of that this year, but at the same time, we were up there early, but the ice is also retreating early, which is another, impact of what we saw. And so it kind of, in a way, was retreating as we were advancing. So we had quite a run before we finally ended up in the ice.
Did you notice anything immediately different, Bryce, than you were expecting to see?
Well, I mean, frankly, I'll just say that compared to my previous trips to the Arctic, the weather was just uncannily pleasant. Like the temperature really never dropped below 0 degrees. We had a record number of sunny days. The wind was really low and very calm. And honestly, we were outside sometimes, working in T-shirts. The students had been posting pictures to Instagram in their Hawaiian shirts on the back deck of the helo where the helicopters land. So I think the really outstanding thing was that it was quite warm in the Arctic.
Yeah, I think there was one day actually where we were 57 degrees Fahrenheit, I think. It got quite warm. I started my broadcasts, in my usual full, heavy-duty float suit, and then by the end of the day I was just in a fleece jacket and short sleeves, and that's it. So it was a pretty spectacular swing in temperatures just in that one, 12 to 15-hour period.
So that's actually the good news and the bad news, isn't it?
It is. It makes it lovely to be
Bryce?
up there.
Because that's something you're trying to study, with the effect of that warming that's going on up there.
Yeah, indeed. We're trying to basically see how it's impacting the water, how it's impacting the gas burden, both of methane and carbon dioxide that we see in the water, how it's impacting the microscopic communities, basically the plankton that photosynthesize and provide the base of the food chain. And then, of course, we're trying to see how the rate at which ice loss is kind of moving into the ocean and how that's freshening the ocean and how that's moving around.
And then if you take all those factors and then you build that up to the seabird surveys that were being conducted as well while the ship was underway, it's a great way to see if, what seabird species were in the area. They're what we call an indicator species. So oftentimes you can see if there's a change happening in the environment based on what the seabirds are actually doing, where they are, what they're eating. So by tracking those species and seeing which animals were where in certain numbers, it's nice to put all those different puzzle pieces together and kind of get an overall picture of the environment that we were in.
Let's talk in detail a little bit more about that, Bryce. Let me ask you first about the microbes that you study in the water that eat methane and the part they play in greenhouse gas cycling. Tell us about that.
Okay. Yes. So we have been, for a while, I'd say for the last 10 or 15 years, trying to figure out what exactly is the story with methane in the Arctic. We know that there's quite a reserve of it. Mostly it's found in the seabed in the form of these methane hydrates. It's like an ice crystal that sits on the ocean bottom, and you can bring it up and actually light it on fire. It will burn because it has enough methane in it. And so that's stable at certain temperatures and pressures. And we know that actually since the last ice age, the ground has been rising as a result of rebound because the ice sheet melted away, and that took a large weight off the continent. And so so just as a result of that, we've seen more methane venting from the seabed. And what's interesting is you can observe the methane venting from the seabed, and you can create an inventory based on that. But when you go to the atmosphere, which is where we'd expect that gas to end up, we just don't see the gas there. Like, it's not making it across the interface from the air to the water, or from the water to the air. And so the question is, if we try to balance the budget, where is the missing piece? And one idea is that it's actually the microbes, the bacteria and archaea, of which there are between 10,000 and 1 million in each drop of water, could be eating this as a food source, essentially, and turning it from methane into carbon dioxide.
Well, as the oceans warm, as the water warms, are those bacteria going to disappear themselves, the ones that recycle the methane?
That's a good question. I think one thing that we have seen and what we see is that basically it's kind of like an if you build it, they will come scenario with bacteria. So during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, for example, there was a tremendous microbial response to the oil that was released at the subsurface during that event, because they were adding dispersants to the oil as it would rise, and that caused it to sort of detrain at about 3,000 feet. And at that same level, the oxygen was drawn way down, and when the scientists started to do genetic analysis, they basically found a large abundance and a very rapid response of oxidation of hydrocarbons, including methane. So I'd say these guys are relatively ubiquitous. They're tolerant to a lot of different conditions. The ones that are in the Arctic are designed specifically for cold conditions, so they may not do specifically that well, but the genes that they carry, which allow them to oxidize methane, those will probably be there, and in fact they operate much more quickly when the water warms.
Holly, you're a marine biologist and coordinated some of the animal studies. Tell us what types of animals you saw while you were up there.
We were actually pretty lucky, from what I've gathered from other cruises that have been in the area, and that we saw pretty much all of the marine mammal species you would expect to see in the Arctic. So we saw about 20 maybe polar bears. Were treated to some moms that had cubs as well, and they were all out on the ice floes. We saw bowhead whales. We saw a pod of narwhals. We saw beluga whales outside of Beechey Island. Those we saw from the helicopter. We saw walrus. We saw all different types of seals. My favorite seal is the bearded seal. They have these fantastic array of whiskers in the front that look like a mustache or a beard, and that's why they get their names. But they kind of escorted us out. They were on the individual pieces of ice as we left an area called Pond Inlet. And so it was great to see this diversity. It was kind of a treat, and if you wanted folks to join you on the bridge, that top deck where the captain was, all you had to say was polar bear, and it was like a stampede to the top of the boat. And there was, just to let you know, I want to say there's 9 decks, some 96 stairs from the bottom to the top of the ship. So people were trucking it up these stairs to come see, when there were animals sighted.
Right.
It was pretty great.
And you had a lot of students with you too, right?
Yes, we did. We definitely did. We had a group of 18 undergraduates that were from minority-serving institutions from across the United States, which was great to have them on board and get them engaged and exposed to actual science happening on board a research vessel, let alone an icebreaker. And then we also had graduate students that were participating as well, and they were acting as the student leaders for each of the core research groups, so that they were helping guide the undergrads with their work that was happening on board the boat.
I can imagine it was a pretty crowded bridge by then with everybody up there.
Yeah, it was a pretty big bridge though. We all kind of found our spot, and there was an outside deck if you wanted to be out there as well, or some people would just go out to the front of the ship and look from there as well. But yeah, it was a surprisingly spacious, but still we were all close-knit family type thing on that boat.
Yeah,
it was a nice
thing. I think the calm Swedish sensibility and demeanor played in well there, because they're so stable and mild-mannered, and they were quite happy to host us all on the bridge and entertain the questions from the students. And it's a very warm and welcoming crew aboard the icebreaker Odin.
Yeah, they welcomed the students. That was the best part, is the students really became part of that ship. It wasn't just the research they were doing. They really got to understand how that ship was functioning and how important it was.
Cold water, you're in Swedish environs, they're used to that. You also worked with the local communities up there to get their observations about the area. What kind of changes were they observing, Holly?
Well, what we did was we went into the community that I mentioned called Pond Inlet. We were able to have a barbecue with them one evening, which was great. Food security is actually a big issue in a lot of Arctic communities. It's hard to get food up there. It's expensive. So we were happy to host a barbecue with them all. And then we were able to speak with many of the locals at that point in time. But we returned the second day with a group. We had tour guides from a group called Ikarvik, and that's a local research group that they are actual local scientists there in Pond Inlet that are doing work, doing various research projects, but then they try to work with other scientists from the lower 48 or other countries that are interested in doing work up there to kind of bridge the gap between traditional Inuit knowledge and then modern day science per se. And the interesting thing was when we brought them on board the vessel, and we had actually made a really interesting, we thought we made a really interesting seabird observation when we were transiting from Thule, Greenland. Rick Ludkin, who was our observer from the Canadian Wildlife Wildlife Service had seen a sooty shearwater, and that's a bird that you traditionally see on the northeast coast of Canada. I'm used to seeing them here in New England, but they're not usually up in the Arctic. So Rick made note of that, and then when we talked to the folks from Ikarvik, they said, oh, we see sooty shearwaters all the time around here. And we were like, really? They're like, oh yeah, for at least the last 5 years we've seen them all the time. So Rick made note of that and then was going to share that with our contacts at the Canadian Wildlife Service to then talk further with this group in Pond Inlet. And it's just kind of a nod to the fact of how much knowledge these Arctic communities do have and how important their perspective and the details that they've been keeping on their own are so important.
Interesting.
And to make sure we consider those and incorporate them as we continue to do research up there.
Very, very interesting. I'm Ira Plato. This is Science Friday from WNYC Studios. Talking with Bryce Luce and Holly Morin about their Northwest Passage project. And Bryce, you found, you take ice cores, right? I understand that you found microplastics in the ice cores in the Arctic. Oh.
Yes, Ira, that's correct.
I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, I don't think we knew what to say exactly either. Objectively, we knew that this was a possibility because similar plastics had been found in ice cores in the Central Arctic, in the even further north in the Eurasian and Canada basin. So that's actually how we determined that we would try to make these measurements. We were sort of following in the footsteps of the researchers who'd mapped that out, and we said, well, maybe we can contribute just by looking and seeing what's in the Northwest Passage. And I think that the shocking thing for me was we went out to this beautiful, what's called a multi-year ice flow. So it's an ice flow that's managed to survive a summer and freeze again, basically live another year. And so it's thick. It was almost 10 feet thick, and we had to core it in multiple sections, and then we brought it back to the boat, and Jacob Strock and Alessandra D'Angelo, those are the two the researchers who were leading that part of the work. They went through some steps to concentrate the material inside the ice, and they were worried initially that if they didn't concentrate the entire core, they wouldn't be able to see anything. But as they began the concentration steps, they actually realized that there was so much material in there that then they had to sort of break it out into sections. And what was remarkable, and I think maybe a little bit of a shock to all of us, even though objectively we were expecting it, was that the amount of plastic, basically these filaments that show up at the sort of the millimeter to micron scale, as well as round beads, almost like the micro beads that show up in shampoo and exfoliating body wash. Those kinds of things were really abundant in the ice, much more abundant than in the water, and maybe you could even say of equivalent abundant as the microbes that we often see in the ice itself.
And then they could see if I remember correctly, they could see the microplastics with the naked eye. They didn't have to just look through a microscope to see them. Yep.
Yeah. So,
and you're saying they were as abundant as the algae was in the water.
And I don't want to make too strong a statement of that because we haven't actually done the counting. So we have to go through some sequential steps that couldn't take place on the ship. But we were initially worried that there would be so many algae and so much biotic matter that we wouldn't even see the plastic. In fact, the plastic was in every layer was just as abundant and just as visible. So it was quite high in concentration. But again, I want to reinforce that it was much lower in concentration in the water below and adjacent. So I think what we see is that the sea ice is, as it is for many things, it's a concentrator of the plastic material because of the way it both can trap stuff through atmospheric deposition, so stuff that's wafted in on air masses that come into the Arctic, but also through the way it actually filters seawater through this siphoning pump mechanism that exists throughout the life cycle of the ice. So once it gets in there, then of course it's also trapped. It's kind of frozen in place. And that's what we saw.
So much more to talk about. I wish we had more time. We'll have to have you come back and talk more about this. Bryce Luce and Holly Morin, both of the Northwest Passage Project and both out of the University of Rhode Island in South Kingston, Rhode Island. Thank you both for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ira. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to birds. And birds see the world in color even better than we do. how their supervision might shape their super colorful feathers. Oh, interesting stuff about how birds see and how their feathers actually make those colors. We'll talk about it after the break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. This is Science Friday. I'm Ira Flato. Our book club is mid-flight this summer, reading Jennifer Ackerman's The Genius of Birds. If you've been following along, you know we've been learning about some of the many brilliant tricks birds have, from impressive tool-making talents of crows to elaborate feats of artistry in the bowerbirds of New Guinea. We asked you on our Science Friday Vox Pop app whether birds like bowerbirds can be artistic. Peter Barber in New Zealand thought yes, if we just think what our art is.
Birds can be artistic. I'm a musician. It seems to me that all forms of art, be it music or dance or sculpture or painting, they seem to me to be forms of courtship display. So there you go. I think birds are doing the same thing.
Another test of bird artistry, how about themselves? Birds are some of the most colorful creatures on the planet, from the dazzling iridescent displays of hummingbirds to the many-hued birds of paradise. But it turns out that birds may even be more colorful than we thought, since their vision sees well into the ultraviolet range. And researchers studying bird feathers are finding there's more than meets the eye in bird plumage, patterns only visible in the UV range, and colors that look the same to us, but from a different bird's eye view seem quite different. That's all quite interesting stuff, and that's what we're going to be talking about with my guest, Dr. Mary Caswell-Stoddard, Assistant Professor of Ecology, Evolutionary Biology at Princeton University. Welcome, Dr. Stoddard.
Thank you.
And Dr. Allison Schultz, Assistant Curator of Ornithology at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles in L.A. Welcome, Dr. Schultz.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Nice to have you. Let me ask you first, what's so special about how birds see the world?
Well, I can go ahead and answer that. Well, you know, as you just mentioned, birds see more than we can. So as humans, we have 3 types of cones in our eyes that can detect color, kind of red, green, and blue. And if we're talking, you know, what part of the electromagnetic spectrum we see from about 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. But birds actually have a 4th type of cone in their eye, and this cone resides in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. So from a bird's eye view, they can actually see down to 300 nanometers and all the way up to 700. And that 4th cone type actually gives them kind of, you know, 3-dimensional vision, where we have somewhat, we could think of as 2-dimensional color vision.
Does every bird have this?
I would just chime in there. Yes, we think that this is a widespread feature of bird vision. We call this tetrachromatic. Birds have these 4 types of color cones or photoreceptors in their eyes. And a lot of times you might think that just gives birds the ability to see all of the colors we humans can see, plus some ultraviolet tacked on. But actually, we think that birds can perceive an extra dimension of color. They have very interesting combination colors, like ultraviolet plus green and ultraviolet plus red, that we can't even imagine. These are very special colors that we believe birds can perceive.
That is just crazy. They've got another dimension that you can mix colors with, right?
Exactly.
So they can create a crazy purple we can't see, or some other thing. We need a new word for it because we don't have that color.
Yep.
That's right, and we do think that these colors exist in the environment. As you mentioned, they are producing some of these special colors with their feathers, and we know that flowers have some of these colors in them too. And so these colors exist for these birds in their natural world.
Huh. Okay, here's a question. I've thought about this. When did birds evolve this ability? And I'm asking you this because we talk about dinosaurs as being birds. Did dinosaurs have this ability also? Cassie, what do you think?
Well, dinosaurs very likely had tetrachromatic vision, very similar to modern birds. This type of visual system exists in many fish and lizards, and it is ancient. It evolved early in vertebrates, and we know now that many dinosaurs had feathers, and probably very colorful feathers too. So it's not just that they had tetrachromatic vision, probably, but they must have looked more stunning to each other than we can even fathom.
So do you think our mammal human ancestors had this ability, but we lost it somewhere along the line?
That's exactly right. We think that this ancient tetrachromatic visual system changed through our own evolutionary history. Mammals lost 2 of the 4 color cone types, and it was one group of primates, the old world primates, that re-evolved a 3rd color cone that gives modern humans the trichromatic or 3 color cone system that we enjoy today.
Wow. So if birds see the world differently, does this mean they look different to each other than they look to us? I mean, it would seem that they do.
Allison, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. So absolutely. So, birds definitely look different to how they look different to each other than how we perceive them, and that's actually shaped, how we're studying how bird colors evolved. In the past, there was really a bias to thinking about how bird colors evolved from a human visual perspective. We categorize things as what we think of as colorful, as we think of as drab, but, there's a lot that we're simply missing. So, for example, I study a group of birds called tanagers, and if you were to look in field guides, you would think that about 50% of tanagers, or about half of tanagers, the males and the females are the same color. However, when I measured all these tanagers and kind of applied an avian visual model, so we model how we think birds are seeing each other, actually we think about 93%, or almost all of them, actually have differences between the males and the females that we simply can't perceive with our eyes.
That's quite interesting. Our number is 844-724-8255, 844-724-8255. You can also tweet us at SciFry. Now, color is often a really important part of how birds mate, right? Is this why they have this enhanced color vision, Cassie?
Well, color is definitely seductive, and we think that many colorful birds have evolved these vibrant feathers to attract mates. We do some work in my lab on the broad-tailed hummingbird in the Colorado Rockies, and they have spectacular iridescent feathers that they use in their own courtship displays. And of course, some of the most charismatic birds that come to mind are using color. But there are other reasons to have plumage and feathers that have particular colors beyond mate choice. So they can be used for social interactions if birds are communicating their dominance in a group, for example, or it can be used for individual recognition. Of course, plumage can also be important for camouflage. There's a bird called the ptarmigan that can change color with the season, actually. So in the winter, its plumage matches the snow, and in summer, its feathers have molted. It gets a new plumage in, and that matches the dirt and the rocky substrate. So there are many different explanations for why birds are colorful or why they are drab.
Do we know why, as a rule, that male birds are more colorful than females? Is it just because of that mating attraction?
Generally, we do think that, what we've seen in almost all cases, males are more colorful females, and it probably is due to mate choice, either to attract females or to have males kind of communicate amongst each other to kind of avoid conflicts of territoriality or to gain access to different resources. So yes, for the most part, males are more colorful. Now, interestingly, there are some species where the roles are reversed, where females are actually the ones who are choosing, the males are choosing the females might have multiple mates, and in those cases, actually the females are more colorful. So, we kind of see both things, but for the most part, it is the males who are more colorful.
Cassie, you're looking at hummingbird mating displays as one example of birds using color in a really interesting way. What are male hummingbirds doing to impress the females?
Well, the males that we study, the male broad-tailed hummingbirds, they perform these absolutely dazzling courtship dives to females. These males fly more than 50 feet sort of straight up in the air, and then they do a death-defying U-shaped dive over the female's head. And you really have to see it to believe it. I mean, the first time I saw it, I almost fell over. But at the bottom of the dive, the males are going extremely fast, and they snap their tail feathers together to make a very loud buzz. And they show off their magenta iridescent throat feathers. And in my lab, we've been analyzing these dives, and we've discovered that all of the action happens in about 300 milliseconds, right at the base of the dive. And that's, if you blink your eyes, that's 300 milliseconds. So these males have evolved to deliver a sensory explosion of sound and color and speed to females right at the correct moment.
That is quite. I've been trying to attract hummingbirds for years. I've been pretty successful lately. But I have not seen that dive maneuver. I will have to look out for it. But one thing I do notice when I look at the hummingbirds is that the colors seem to oscillate, is the way I could put it. The colors seem to change iridescence a little bit as I'm looking at the feathers. What is going on there?
Well, iridescence is a very special type of color. Birds can make their colors in many different ways. They can have pigments that they are producing inside their bodies or that they're obtaining from the diet, or they can have colors that are called structural colors. And in these colors, it's the interaction of light with the feather structure itself that gives a bird feather a particular appearance. So a blue jay blue is one type of structural color, and if you grind up a blue jay feather, you'd just be left with black dust because you've disrupted the feather structure at that point. Iridescence is a structural color as well, and that's where the appearance of the color changes with the angle formed by the light and the feather and the viewer's eye. And so that's what you're observing with hummingbirds, this sort of special angle-dependent kind of color. And if you were to dissect a hummingbird feather and look under the microscope, you would see little layers of blobs called melanosomes packed with a black melanin pigment arranged in very precise layers. And it's how the light is interacting with these layers that gives hummingbirds their iridescent appearance.
Myra Flato, this is Science Friday from WNYC Studios. Talking with Allison Schultz and Cassie Stoddard about bird color. We have some listeners who'd like to join us, and we're always happy to have them. Let's go to Tony in Minnesota. Hi, welcome to Science Friday.
Hi, thanks for having me. A really interesting show. I had a question. The two speakers had earlier mentioned that this fourth kind of cone in these birds' eyes allowed them to see another dimension of color. And I was wondering if they could maybe unpack that a little more. Like, is that another spatial dimension, or is this just kind of like a new concept altogether? Thanks.
Yeah, good question.
Well, when we say another dimension of color, it's kind of like, so if we think about where, like a human color space, you can think about how hues exist in a two-dimensional space where you have kind of, how the proportions of red, green, and blue will make up a hue that we see. However, with this when you add a fourth cone there, basically you now have to turn that two-dimensional space into a three-dimensional space. And so it's not simply, it's hard for us to imagine because we have our own sensory systems. But, when I talk to people and try, everybody always asks me, hey, Allison, could you make some sort of goggles or something that could make us see like birds? And unfortunately, we can't because our brains are just not wired that way. But one thing I like to do is kind of take a picture and turn off one of the colors that we see. So, for example, red. So if you turned off all red in a picture, it would be very different from what we see. And so you can kind of imagine adding a whole nother dimension in that way.
Yeah.
That's kind of the closest I can come up with.
And in fact, we've had a Twitter question came in that I was wondering about. Is there a set of goggles or glasses or something that we could use to see what the birds see? Anybody
Well,
make that?
as Allison mentioned, that is a pipe dream, but it's really more complicated than that, because we know that it's about how these 4 types of color cones interact with one another, and so we don't have the neurons to compute what these colors might actually look like, even if we could have goggles or a particular camera that can detect the UV. Now, even if we can't have goggles that really give us a bird's eye view of the world, we do have technology that allows us to capture UV reflected light in the environment and in feathers, and that's something that we're working on in the lab, and I know Allison is doing work in this realm as well, and that's been a really exciting move forward for our field, that now we can use ultraviolet sensitive cameras to go out and take pictures and measure where ultraviolet light resides. And we are finding in lots of bird feathers that there's hidden ultraviolet color embedded in plumage patches that we can use this technology to highlight.
I just got about 30 seconds to go. One last question for Cassie. You also looked at birds' eggs. Is color important also in the bird eggs?
Absolutely. Birds lay spectacularly colorful eggs. My favorite is the emerald green egg laid by the emu, which is a large flightless bird. And we know that egg color can be used for camouflage or thermoregulation, but it can also be really important for deception. So we work on a bird called the common cuckoo that sneaks its eggs into the nests of other species, and it leaves all parental care to these host birds. And they're really ultimate freeloaders. And these cuckoos have evolved eggs that can precisely mimic the color and pattern of the host eggs, so the other birds won't notice. So they're really the forgers of the bird world. And if you want to learn something really interesting about color and deception, look up cuckoo eggs, because there's so much cool stuff there.
Cassie Stoddard, Assistant Professor of Ecology, Evolutionary Biology at Princeton, and Allison Schultz, Assistant Curator of Ornithology at the Natural History Museum of LA. Thank you both for joining us today. Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much for having us.
You can learn more about the bird vision and researchers working to digitize all these crazy plumage colors in a new article on our website, sciencefriday.com/color. Plus, crazy about crows or ravens or other members of the corvid family. Learn more about crow funerals, grudges, and other feats of intellect from Kaylee Swift in a Reddit AMA, Ask Me Anything. That's next Monday at noon Eastern. All that and more on our website at sciencefriday.com/book club. We'd like to thank all the folks here at Texas Public Radio who have helped us get our program on the air today. Wayne Cobble, Ruben Garcia, the great folks at Texas Public Radio in San Antonio who made us so welcome here today. And for you Texas folks in Texas, we hope to see you tomorrow night at the Tobin Center here in San Antonio. Still a few tickets left. sciencefriday.com/San Antonio. Until then, in San Antonio, I'm Ira Flato. This is Science Friday. I'm Ira Flato, coming to you today from the studios of Texas Public Radio in San Antonio. Later in the hour, a trip out to the giant gas giants, Jupiter and Saturn. But first, time to check in on the state of science.
This is KER for WWNO, St. Louis Public Radio,
Iowa Public Radio News.
Local science stories of national importance, and us being Texas Public Radio in San Antonio. Chances are you use some of the internet services each day all over Texas. Maybe you get your entertainment there, you communicate with friends and family, use it to buy things. It is an ever-growing part of people's lives and businesses. But here in Texas, where everything is bigger, almost 2 million people are without access to high-speed internet. And the size and wide-open spaces of the state can make wiring rural communities something of, let's call it, a challenge. Joining me to talk about it is Paul Flav, technology and entrepreneurship reporter at Texas Public Radio. He's here with me in San Antonio.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us here today. It's nice to be here. So, okay, let's talk about how big the digital divide is. What's the population of Texas, and what percentage of those people?
Yeah, so it's about 28 million people in Texas, and around 2 million are without internet access or access to high-speed internet, and they estimate about 80% of those are in rural areas.
Where would rural areas be in Texas, for example? all over the place.
All over the place. I mean, there's some big hubs like, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, but all of West Texas, a lot of East Texas, once you get past Houston and north of Houston. So it's a big swath of the state.
So we might not know how many people the exact numbers are. Right?
Yeah, because of the way that the FCC collects data on who has access and who doesn't, it's ISP provided, so it's the AT&Ts, the Verizons of the world, tell us how many people they think have access, and it's broken down by census block. So if one person in a census block has access, they say the whole census block has access. So the estimates have been kind of widely discredited, and the FCC is trying to figure out a better way of collecting all that data. They just voted to change that last week.
And of course, everybody's trying to figure out a better way of getting internet service then.
Absolutely.
Out to the rural areas. What's the problem? From an outsider's point of view, why don't you just string some more cable and get everybody covered?
Absolutely. Well, we rely on, for-profit companies to make those things happen. And the equation just doesn't work out in a lot of these communities when you're talking about a service that has a lot of a cost associated with dragging a fiber optic cable along these poles, the people that own getting the permission of property owners, things like that, and then providing service for maybe a handful of people just doesn't add up.
So it's a question of money. It's always a question of money, right?
Often it is, yes.
Because everybody has this private lands. The whole state is private lands and no room for public access ways.
That's right. There's a lot of Texas is private, and getting the permission to cross people's land has just recently changed for some of these rural cooperatives, electric cooperatives, so that they can actually get permission. They can just send out a notice, hey, we're doing this, and only if a landowner who may or may not be in the state opts in or opts out do they have to worry about it.
Okay, let's talk about what we like to talk about, the technology fix.
Sure.
Oh, let's put a satellite up. Let's wait for 5G. Put more towers in.
Absolutely. I think 5G has been talked about a lot, but 5G, especially in rural areas, is a real big question mark because 5G has to be a lot more densely populated, and they all connect to something. They all connect to a fiber cable, and if there's no fiber cable, then there's no 5G. For satellites, you're talking about the SpaceXs and Amazons and OneWeb of the world. They collectively want to put up tens of thousands of these broadband satellites. It's unclear how fast they'll be. There are some satellite options now, but they're pretty slow. That's the complaints anyway.
In your series, you reported it on how in many ways this is like the drive to rural electrification in years past, and they accomplished that with rural co-ops.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so now 80 years ago, in the 1930s, the federal government decided that it wanted to invest in electrifying these communities to give them options for, running water, powering pumps that can run water, electric stoves, things like that. And they thought that was a worthwhile thing. They put money into these cooperatives so that local communities could run their own systems and they would be responsible for kind of making sure they were maintained as well as just keeping them running, and it seemed to work. And now you've got those same rural cooperatives formed with federal loan dollars reaching millions of homes with electricity are stepping in to take on broadband in Texas. So I think there's 4 million broadband users, 4 million electric co-op customers, and about 30,000 of them right now. So less than 1% are broadband, but it's growing.
And you spoke with the head of one of these. I have a clip here of these rural cooperatives about why they do this.
It's not about making money. You're not doing this to make money. You're doing this to allow your communities to survive and to be here 20 years from now.
Absolutely. That was Bill Hetherington, CEO of Bandera Electric Cooperative, just northwest of San Antonio. And, that's the how they talk about this. This is not something that is optional. This is something that has to happen if these communities are going to survive. And
they from the quote you played, that they do feel like community spirit. It is not a money issue with them. It is something that, this is the future of the country is heading this way. We have to help out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that people have. It's kind of become this mission for a lot of people. And when it is he lives there. Yeah. This is his community. So that's kind of the beauty of the co-op model, is that there's an incentive for them to do it, but also it has to be approved by members and the customers, so they have to decide to go into that business.
And you talked about how 80 years ago this was the cooperatives were formed to put electricity in. Today you would never argue, but 80 years ago you would never argue, hey, who needs electricity? But today internet service is about as needed, or people depend upon it as much as electricity was.
I think we're at a moment in time where the idea of internet and high-speed internet as a luxury is over. It's changing, and I think in those communities they are demanding it. You talk to local economic development people as well as just city council people, and they're getting asked, "Where's the internet?"
So, is the state of Texas putting money into this? Is the federal government putting money into this?
The feds have a lot of money tied up in this. $20 billion, I think they just passed over 10 years last week for the Rural Opportunity Fund. And then the state of Texas is not currently funding it with any legislative or grant funds. There was just a session, and they didn't pass any bills that had any money attached, but there were a couple.
But it would seem that in certain places you could not survive. I mean, physically and communally. Like, let's say, for example, hospitals. Don't hospitals have to be wired to the internet?
Yeah, there's a big question right now about hospitals. And there are programs that specifically target libraries and schools and critical places like hospitals that try and get them funding so that it'll bring down the cost of high-speed internet to these places. But in Texas, I think we've lost about 23, 24 hospitals in just the last 5 years in rural communities, which is often the thing that they say is going to replace that when we talk about rural communities and aging in place is telehealth. But a lot of these places don't have the infrastructure.
Yeah, if you can't get to your doctor or you live in a rural community, you may be able to send your symptoms in by telephone or by the internet, but if you don't have that internet connection,
if it's not reliable, in the course of doing some of this reporting, there was at least one couple in Corrigan, Texas, I talked to that were lamenting just how unreliable their internet connection was, and how even just a basic doctor's appointment requires you log in and sign up for a slot. So,
we've heard about the digital divide in the rest of the country between have and have not schools. So this would also be affecting school children learning how to become fluent in the coding or the internet. Also, you're going to have a section that cannot do that.
Absolutely. I don't have any hard data on how that impacts them, but you do hear from basically every one of the communities I've visited to talk about this. At least one person will bring up the fact that kids are hanging out in the parking lot of the library after it closes to get access to Wi-Fi. They're going to McDonald's not for the burgers, but for the free Wi-Fi access. So,
is it becoming a political issue at all, or is it still something on the peripheral?
I mean, it's hard to say if it's becoming like a political issue. Obviously, it's not something people are running on in Texas, but we just saw the Warren campaign publish a big broadband plan that allotted $85 billion in grants for this issue, as well as, would preempt a lot of states' laws that prevent them from having municipal broadband.
So if you think that the Democrats may think that Texas is in play during this presidential election, they might come and use this as an issue.
It might be. I mean, it will. I think having those conversations with the Warren campaign being the first, it may very well be that they push a lot of other communities and other leaders to start introducing this kind of legislation.
And as far as the long-term outlook, does anybody believe that sooner or later this is not going to come out to the rural neighborhoods?
I mean, it's hard to say that it's inevitable. I think there's a lot of people working on it, and I think I've never kind of seen it get as talked about it as it is now, just in the last 18 months. So I think we are at a special moment in time where everyone is sort of paying attention to this, and even banks have a stake in this with wanting to reduce their brick and mortar shops and being able to invest in these programs with Federal Reserve CRA stuff. So I think there's a lot of interest, and it's hard to say though whether or not it's gonna absolutely happen.
Yeah. Do people say, hey, you choose to live out there in the ranches and the far places? Heck with you.
I'm sure they do, and that's what that's one of the big things. That's one of the big draws of living in these communities is they don't have some of these things that the traffic and the things of the cities. But that's what we're already at a point where these communities realize that people are passing on their towns, living in them, locating businesses in them because they don't have high-speed internet. So.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Thank you for taking time to be with us. This is a really interesting topic, Paul.
Thanks so much.
Paul Flav, technology and entrepreneurship reporter at Texas Public Radio. This is Science Friday. I'm Ira Flato. I want you to come back with me now to the summer of 1665. Astronomer Giovanni Cassini is peering through a telescope, as one does on summer evenings. A friend has just tipped him off to an unusual spot on the planet, Jupiter. Cassini observes and concludes that this spot seems to be permanent, a giant spot spinning like a cyclone in the southern tropics of Jupiter. Well, today we know that swirling storm Cassini saw was probably what we call the Great Red Spot, a storm system 2 planet Earths could fit inside. But you know what? For some reason, after hundreds of years of observation, that long-lasting storm now appears to be shrinking. And luckily, we are in the right place at the right time to observe the planet, a lot closer than Cassini was. Our observation point, the Juno spacecraft, which just zoomed over the red spot to study it. So for the rest of the hour, we're going to be talking about what it found and the many new missions in the works to uncover the mysteries of Jupiter, its neighbor Saturn, and their dozens of moons. And if you have a question about Jupiter or Saturn, you want to sound off on which of the two giants is your favorite, because people keep debating this all the time, give us a call. Our number 844-724-8255, 844-SciTalk, or you can tweet us at SciFri. Let me introduce my guest. Excuse me. Scott Bolton is principal investigator of the Juno mission and a co-investigator on the Cassini mission, named, of course, for Giovanni Cassini. He's also associate vice president at the Southwest Research Institute. He joins me here at the studios of Texas Public Radio in San Antonio. Welcome back to Science Friday, Dr. Bolton.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
Nice to have you back. Also with us is Tracy Becker, a planetary scientist at the Southwest Research Institute and co-investigator on the UV instrument on the upcoming NASA Europa Clipper mission. She's also here at TPR. Welcome, Dr. Becker.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Nice to have you. Scott, Juno just flew over the red spot a few weeks ago, and the spot is changing. Is that surprising? Shrinking a little bit?
It is surprising. Especially since it's been observed since the days of Cassini, and maybe it was there earlier. So you've got this great storm sitting there for 300 years or more, and now all of a sudden it's changing. So that was a big surprise to us. We're watching it shrink, and we flew over, as you say, just a few weeks ago. We've done it before. This time we were doing a very special experiment where we were trying to detect to see if we could see a sense of the gravity field that might be tied to it, so that we could try to make an estimate or constrain how deep that storm went. It's too early for me to give you the answer to that. We're still combing through the data, trying to figure out what it means. But what we're searching for is how deep did that root go?
Because it's a ball of gas, right? It could go pretty deep.
It's a giant ball of gas. I mean, it's like a hurricane or a tornado. It must be working differently than that because it's Jupiter and there's no sea or land underneath. But it's a giant funnel cloud of some kind, and the question is there some signature?
I'm trying to wrap my head around a giant funnel cloud the size of 2 Earths. Wow.
And very deep. So it's going to look pretty ominous if you were flying through the atmosphere.
If it's shrinking, is it shrinking quickly? Is it going to disappear in our lifetime, or is it just really slowly?
Well, it's shrinking, and I would say that it's quickly in the sense that we can detect it over a few decades. Since the days of Voyager, it's definitely shrunk in size. Is it going to disappear? There are people that, extrapolate that shrinking and try to make an estimate of when it would disappear. But I think that's a little bit like, getting up in the morning and weighing yourself and say, wow, I lost 10 pounds. So how long before I disappear?
Dr. Becker, let's turn to Saturn now, because one of the things you've been studying are Saturn's rings. What have you learned about them that we didn't know?
That's right. So the Cassini mission was orbiting Saturn for about 13 years, and it collected a lot of data about Saturn's rings. One of the things that I was most interested in were the particle sizes that make up Saturn's rings. So trying to find some of the smallest stuff. And what we did was we used this really cool technique that instead of staring at the rings themselves and looking at the reflected sunlight, we actually pointed our instrument at a background star and let the rings come in front of that star. And using that, we can say a lot about the actual structure of the rings and what the particle sizes that make up the rings look like.
Can you say how many rings Saturn has? Is that a trick question?
So they're all named. So
Right.
the main rings are the A, B, and C rings. Those are the ones that you can kind of see with a regular telescope. And then there's some more diffuse rings, like the D ring, the E ring, the G ring, and a very skinny, exciting ring called the F ring.
Yeah.
So there's a handful of rings.
I remember watching Voyager go past Saturn, and when they discovered the F ring and how weird it was.
Yeah, so the F ring is a super exciting place where it's kind of at the edge of where Saturn's gravity has more power or less power to destroy objects as they form. So it's kind of at the edge of where the self-gravity can actually start to allow objects to start to accrete. But then Saturn's gravity still interferes. There's a lot of collisions, really exciting collisions happening in that area, in that particular ring. And so you see all of these collisions and building up of the ice particles, and so you can really see how stuff forms and then gets destroyed in a fun way.
So well, let's talk about why is there stuff? Why is it, if Saturn is a gas giant? Why is its rings have stuff that are made out of what, ice or particles, or what does it make? What are they made out of?
Yeah, so the rings look like they're this place that maybe you could go ice skating, but that's
Right.
not the case. It's all made up of individual particles that range in sizes of micron-sized dust up to house-sized boulders, pretty much, and then a handful of objects that are a bit larger than that. And at first, there was always this thought that maybe these rings formed right around the time Saturn formed, but recent results from Cassini at the end of the mission started to really show that these rings probably formed only about 100 million years ago. So some sort of breakup of maybe an icy moon or some comets that came by.
So if you were a dinosaur, you could have seen that.
That's right. If they had figured out how to use telescopes or binoculars, they could have seen it happening.
And do we know where the stuff came from? Was it captured by Saturn, or where did the material come from?
So that's sort of the underlying question still is, was it a moon of Saturn's that kind of moved in its orbit and somehow got disrupted by Saturn's gravity, or was it incoming comets? Those are still sort of areas of active research.
You know, there was a paper published maybe last week, a week ago, about the Earth and the Moon. And maybe at one point our moon was formed as it started out as a ring around the Earth. Possible?
Well, so the leading idea there is that there was some sort of a collision event that happened with the Earth early on. And so that would have spewed out a lot of material, probably did form some sort of a disk before it was able to coalesce into the current moon that we have today.
Mm-hmm. That is quite interesting. Scott, why is it that Saturn has such spectacular rings, but Jupiter has such wimpy? Uranus has a ring too, kind of wimpy ring.
It's true, and very little about Jupiter's wimpy. But the ring might be...
No insult meant to...
The ring might be one of them. No, I'm not... I've worked on Cassini too, so I like both planets. Do
you have a favorite?
I don't. My favorite's actually Earth, and it might be, sort of, tied to the fact that I'm here. And I also, like to ski and surf and snowboard, and we got it all. But anyway, you asked about the rings.
Getting back to the rings.
So, there's a theory that was proposed some time ago called ring rain, which Cassini at the end has sort of seen some evidence of. And it has to do with the magnetic field interacting with the ring and causing things to get pulled out of the ring and back into the planet, and the question is how much of that material disappears. And we saw some evidence at the very end of Cassini. We sent the spacecraft into the upper part of the atmosphere, and we were able to measure with the ion and neutral mass spectrometer some of this material, and it looks like the ring rain idea is possibly true. And what that ring rain idea has, it sounds like you would just say, well, I'm raining stuff out of the ring, which is exactly what you're doing, but it's all connected to the magnetic field and the tilt of the magnetic field and the strength of the magnetic field. And Saturn, Jupiter's strong sometimes and wimpy in other ways, like the ring, and Saturn is a wimp with respect to the magnetic field. It has really a weak magnetic field, perfectly aligned with the body. We don't understand that. We have no theory that really explains how that magnetic field comes about like that. But the fact that it's so aligned and so weak may be tied to why it is able to sustain a ring. And if you had that kind of if it had a magnetic field like Jupiter, that ring might not be there.
Quite interesting. And that's one of the reasons why with Juno, it dives in from millions of miles away to just a couple of thousand miles of Jupiter and then goes back again because that magnetic field is so strong. It might destroy.
No, well, it might, but that's not why we do it. It's tied to the magnetic field.
Yeah.
Because of the strength of that magnetic field, Jupiter is surrounded by radiation, really incredibly high radiation, particles that are moving very close to the speed of light. Those are really dangerous to a spacecraft. The magnetic field is as well, but it's the combination of those two. The magnetic field enables this force field, that's super strong, packed with radiation, weapons, basically to a spacecraft or life. And so we dart in and dart out as fast as we can. We come screaming through, barely touch it if we can, and then go out where it's safe, lick our wounds, and then go back in for another shot.
Mm-hmm. We have listeners calling in. Let's go to the phones. Let's go to Joe in Florida. Hi, Joe.
Hello. Question.
Hey there, go.
Why are the outer planets gas giants and the inner planets rocky, small planets? I'm curious.
Good question. Who want to tackle that one? Why are the inner ones like us rocky and the outer ones gas giants?
So that's a question that people that are trying to study solar system formation ask all the time, and one of the reasons is the early inner planets like us may have started with a little bit bigger of a gas envelope, and we lost it because we didn't have enough mass. And we were closer to the sun, so things were warmer, and the hydrogen and the helium would have escaped, whereas Jupiter was big and massive, and so are the other outer planets, and they were able to hold on to it. That's one idea, but there's other reasons in the sense that Jupiter may have formed first, and then the outer planets form, and they grab all this material, this gas, and we may or may not have started that way, although I would not be surprised. We may have not built a big enough mass at the Earth to grab all of that light element gas because it's hot when it's this close to the sun, and it's moving quite fast, and so you need a big gravity field to grab onto it.
Yeah. Dr. Becker, you're working on an upcoming mission to Jupiter's moon Europa called the Europa Clipper. Why is Europa of such interest, and what's the mission going to do?
Yeah, so Europa is this icy moon of Jupiter. It's one of the Galilean satellites, so it was detected by Galileo back in the 1600s. And it is, while it has an icy shell, it actually has a liquid water ocean underneath that shell. And there is actually more liquid water ocean there than in all of the Earth's oceans combined. And so whenever we think about water in the solar system, we naturally start to think about the potential for life. And so NASA's Europa Clipper mission, its main goal is to assess the habitability of Europa. So the idea of could life, at least as we sort of understand it, have lived there, currently live there, or potentially live there in the future in those oceans.
I'm Ira Flato. This is Science Friday from WNYC Studios. Coming to you from San Antonio, Texas Public Radio, talking about Jupiter and Saturn. What about, Enceladus? Doesn't it have liquid water on it too?
It does. So that was one.
How do you make the choice between you take a boat?
So Europa's ocean has been known about for longer. So the Galileo spacecraft that orbited Jupiter in the 1990s was the one that first detected that liquid water ocean. With Enceladus, we didn't know for sure that there was a liquid water ocean there until Cassini arrived there in about 2005, 2004. And when that detection was made, it took a few flybys and a little bit more data to understand that really was that there was liquid water. And the way they found it was that it was actually spitting out that water in these water vapor plumes. So basically like water volcanoes on Enceladus. So the works were already there to go to Europa, I think, first. But there are plenty of people who would love to go back to Enceladus and see if they can better explore that moon as well.
Mm-hmm. Go to both places.
I am for it.
You know what I always find interesting when I talk about this, about Jupiter, especially about Jupiter, is how science fiction writers have known that Jupiter is the place to go to find the interesting stuff. And most recently, Arthur C. Clarke, 2001, when you went to the moon, they found a monolith. It was beaming its stuff out to Jupiter. Right? And in 2010, a quote from the book, "All these worlds are yours except Europa. Attempt no landing there." You familiar with that?
Yes.
What is the romance about the planets, the moons of Jupiter? I mean, do you have that same feeling?
Oh, yeah, definitely. All of the moons of of Jupiter are fantastic. I mean, you have Io spewing out volcano material as well as the most active volcano world in our solar system. Europa probably also has these water vapor plumes that we've detected. And from early on, you could tell by how bright these moons are, like Enceladus and Europa, that they are mostly water ice on the surface. And so that, of course, just leads to that intrigue of what else is there.
And not to leave Saturn out, Tracy, what about Titan, a mission to Titan called Dragonfly?
Yes.
How did that get its name? What's going on?
Oh, I'm not directly involved in that mission, but the idea, I think, behind the name of it is the fact that there will be something flying around on Titan. So NASA recently selected that mission to go and explore Titan. It's the largest moon of Saturn, and what makes it so exciting is that it has a hydrological cycle just like the Earth has, except that it's with methane instead of with water. So it's too cold for water to be in the forms of lakes and clouds and rain. But methane, which is a gas here, is at the right temperature at Titan. And so you actually have an atmosphere, you have clouds, you have rain, and you have lakes made out of that methane.
And so what's the mission? We're going to fly a little robot around?
That's right. It's
enough atmosphere to actually...
Yep, and that's what makes it so exciting. So it's sort of like a quadcopter, but there's 8 propellers to fly it around. And so it'll be able to explore different, very interesting locations fairly easily because it can pick back up, fly to the next location, and look there as well.
So there's not a companion rover that's going to go anyplace. You don't need one if you can fly around.
That's right. Yeah.
And how soon do we think this will happen?
So again, I'm not part of that mission. I think the launch date is in the early 2020s. Scott, later. 2030s.
Yeah. All right.
Early 2020s. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That's close enough.
It's a drone, basically.
It's basically a drone flying around.
And you know what's great about it is, Titan, we already know from Cassini, which dropped a probe there called Huygens that the Europeans built. But we saw, coastlines, mountain ranges. And so you're going to have a drone flying around coastlines. I mean, it's going to be spectacular. And it can move around and check different samples and also investigate, the habitability of another ocean world.
We're going to talk more with Scott Bolton and Tracy Becker about the ocean worlds of Jupiter and Saturn and their planets and their moons, I should say. Stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. Don't go away. This is Science Friday. I'm Ira Flato, coming to you from the studios of Texas Public Radio in San Antonio. We're talking about exploring giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn, this hour. And we have lots of great pictures of Jupiter's swirling atmosphere and Saturn's rings up at sciencefriday.com/planets. And they're really excellent stuff. And we had fun this week. We had a little fun. We asked you to weigh in on the Science Friday Vox Pop app about which planet was better, Jupiter or Saturn, a planetary smackdown. A few of you chose Saturn, like Mendy in Hilo, Hawaii.
I think Saturn is better than Jupiter just because of the amazing, beautiful rings. They're the icing on the cake.
You can hear the frogs chirping in the background. Oh, that's great. Thanks, Mendy. But the real surprise was that almost all our listeners on Science Friday Vox Pop app weighed in for Team Jupiter. Let's take a listen to that side.
Jupiter's unequivocally better with all those wonderful bands and that angry red spot, the storm on the surface. Plus, it's bigger. Saturn is not only substantially smaller, but its surface is relatively bland. It does have rings, I'll give you that.
I think Jupiter is better than Saturn because one of its moons, Europa, may possibly have life on it and has sparked the imagination of scientists and sci-fi authors for decades.
I don't understand how this is even a question. Jupiter's clearly superior. It has the Galilean moons, which showed Galileo that there were things orbiting planets, not just the Earth. Jupiter cleared out all these asteroids, so we don't have to live with impacts every day on Earth. Jupiter has the Trojan groups, which are fascinating and underexplored. The solar system is the Sun, Jupiter, and various errata. Errata like Saturn.
Ooh, errata. Saturn is an errata. Tough love from Nathan Hunter in Vancouver, Gibson in Denver, and Peter Barber in New Zealand. And if you want to join in and let us know what you think, are you Team Saturn? Are you Team Jupiter? Download the Science Friday Vox Pop app and leave us your voice comment. And if there are any diehard Saturn supporters out there, let your voice be heard. Now, on the Science Friday Vox Pop app, now it's time to bring my debate back to my studio debaters here with me, Scott Bolton and Tracy Becker. Scott Bolton is principal investigator on the Juno mission. He's from the Southwest Research Institute here in San Antonio. Also, Tracy Becker, planetary scientist. She's on the NASA Europa Clipper mission. Scott, tough love for Saturn on that one.
Yeah, I really felt bad for it there.
I have to say, having a backyard telescope of my own and having looked at Saturn and Jupiter, each one, I mean, I'm not trying to, smooth this smackdown over, but when you look in a nice night and you can see those Galilean moons of Jupiter out there, you have the same little rush, I think, that Galileo had. They're just sparkling out there, lined up in a row. Sometimes there's a little shadow across Jupiter. And the same thing with Saturn. When you see a nice tilt, the moon, the rings are tilted just the right way. It's mind-blowing,
Yeah, the first time I saw Saturn through a telescope, I could have sworn someone was dangling a little silhouette of a planet with rings, just a sticker in front of the telescope, because I couldn't believe how picturesque it was.
I thought Ed Wood was out there with dangling that little. Yeah, it's great. Scott, let's talk about Ganymede, another unique moon, is it not?
Ganymede's very unique. It's the only moon that we've actually seen that has its own magnetic field. So in that sense, it's almost like a planet. It has its own magnetosphere. It's the only one we've ever seen that has that. We discovered that with Galileo when we were flying around, and we got close to it. And I was on one of the teams on Galileo that actually, detected what looked like a magnetosphere. We were looking at plasma wave signatures, and there it was.
That's cool. Let's go to Birmingham, Alabama. Chris in Birmingham. Hi, welcome to Science Friday.
Hi, yes. My question is this about, thanks for taking the call, is this, if the moons are just the major moons around Saturn, are they going to be there forever, like orbiting the planet, or are some going to disappear?
So the moon should be pretty stable around all of the planets. So just like Jupiter's moon should stick around for a while, Saturn's ring should also be there for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, they were 100 million years for Saturn's rings to get there, right?
So, yeah. So, again, the rings are sort of this unique thing. The moons should be have probably been there. Most of the moons, at least, have probably been there since the beginning. Right. And the rings, a lot of people did think that they were there from the beginning, too, until some of those most recent results from Cassini.
There was the theory, Scott, a while back, and maybe it's still a theory, that because the gas giant Jupiter is so big and it has so many satellites, that it was a little solar system that never got started. That Jupiter never turned into the sun. Is that still thought of that way?
Yeah, I mean, they've evolved the theory now that Jupiter, it used to be if it was just 40% more massive, it would have ignited fusion, but I think now they realize it needed to be more massive than that. But it is just shy of being able to have ignited like a star, and we would have been in a double star system. But, even if it doesn't ignite, Jupiter and Saturn are like mini solar systems. I mean, they have these moons. They have really big moons, relatively big moons close to them that are going around. Jupiter in particular has the 4 Galilean moons. And it's like a mini solar system. And, when Juno was approaching, we made a movie where we took a picture every 15 minutes for about 2 weeks. and then put it together. And you can actually watch the satellites go around it. It looks just like a solar system. In fact, we don't have any pictures of our solar system like that. It must be the way we look. You watch these things, and the ones that are closer in are moving around faster. The ones that are further out are moving around slower. And it's sort of what Galileo must have seen and imagined. I mean, he was a brilliant guy. He saw this, and he looked at it and realized, oh, my God, these moons are going around a planet. Or in his view was, these things are going around something else out there. That means Earth's not the center of everything. Changed our perspective of ourselves forever.
Interesting. Let's go to Twitter, because lots of Twitter folks, a lot of planet geeks are checking in. Helen, for example, asks, does Jupiter exercise a rotational torque? I told you we'll get to the geeks. Rotational torque on other planets the way Earth does on Venus. Scott?
Well, it definitely exercises a torque and an effect gravitationally. Whether it's meaningful enough to stop the rotation of other planets, no, or even interact with it because it's pretty far away. But it does do that to its own moons. And so, just like our moon is kind of locked in, we're always looking at the same face. If you're close enough to Jupiter, that's what's going to happen to you.
Let's go to Troy in Gold Canyon, Arizona. Hi, welcome to Science Friday.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm definitely pro-Saturn. Being an amateur astronomer doing sidewalk astronomy, I get a lot more oohs and ahs showing the Lord of the Rings than I ever do showing Jupiter.
You don't get turned on by the moons of Jupiter?
I do as an amateur astronomer, but from the sidewalk astronomy experience, most people are much more impressed when they see Saturn than they are when they see the moons around Jupiter.
Yeah, I actually would have to agree with that. Thanks for calling in with that. I mean, you really can't match those rings, can you?
Yeah,
when they're tilted the right way and you see them.
And when you see them up close too with Cassini, for example, the rings are so broad, but they're so thin, and it's so fascinating to be able to see them up close, as Cassini was able to do. And earlier we were talking about the idea of the moons going around Jupiter kind of looking like a solar system in itself. Saturn's rings also represent this really unique opportunity to understand planet formation. So the way that the ring particles interact with each other, the outside moons, the moons buried in the rings, all of those gravitational influences actually really show scientists how planet formation started, potentially our own. And it also looks a lot like, if you look at ALMA images of distant planetary disks that are forming around distant stars, it kind of looks a lot like Saturn's ring. So there's a lot of cool science to be done there.
Speaking of distant, our next call comes from Ukraine. Michael in Ukraine. Hi, welcome to Science Friday.
Yeah, hi, greetings. My choice is Titan. I'm absolutely gobstruck at the place. It's the most amazing thing in the solar system. It's the only Earth-like atmosphere at all in the solar system, nitrogen and whatever. And it's 1.5 times the pressure. So it's the only place astronauts wouldn't need a pressure suit. They'd need some real good thermal suit because 180 minus centigrade would tend to make you a little crisp. But everything about it is just insane. It's like an alternate universe with rocks of ice and rain of methane and ethane and I don't know, maybe nitrogen, oceans of methane and ethane. It's just it's almost inconceivable. Rains, snows of mixed organics. It's just so cool. I always wanted to go to Europa, and I'd volunteer to go one way, which, some people might cheer. But now I'm really hot on Titan. I just think that's so, it's just such an incredible place.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for the call. Tracy Becker is nodding and smiling.
Well,
the good
news is we get to go to both. So NASA's Europa Clipper mission will be there in the late 2020s, and then Dragonfly will be arriving to Titan not long after that.
He waxed so poetic about. Was he right about Titan? The things that he said, and
yeah,
the way he described it.
Yeah, it's an incredible place.
Yeah, in many ways, it's sort of showing us the history of Earth. When Cassini was going there, one of the arguments was that maybe this is what Earth was like when life was just getting started. And it is full of these lakes. They're methane, so it's like a barbecue waiting to get lit.
Oh, I have a vision now. You've given me a vision that I can take with me. That's quite interesting. We always talk about these scientists like Galileo and Cassini gazing at the planets and the moons, and I'm always wondering, how did they have the spare time to do this? I mean, somebody is picking up their tab for their rent and their food. And, you know, today we think there are great universities or whatever picking up their bill, paying them. Is that the same thing that happened with these ancient astronomers, Galileo and Cassini?
Absolutely. Although I don't think it was just their spare time; they were dedicated.
Yeah.
You know, in the sense of Galileo, he was really the first, right? He was really the first to take a telescope and turn it into some sort of a scientific instrument, and he pointed it up. Now that was his game, and what his goal was. The way he sold it was he took something that wasn't very high quality and couldn't use it, and was able to improve it so that the optics actually worked and you could see stuff. And he started going to the dojis and the royalty in Venice. You know, at that time there were big city-states, and basically said, look, if you pay for this and you help me, you can use this telescope and see ships coming, both the merchant ships that were coming in that maybe they could prepare for the, you know, at that time you could imagine they don't even know when the ship's coming and what it's got. So they'd see one coming. But I think more important, they could see war mongers or somebody coming that might be doing some damage. And so he sold it that way, and then took it and did what he wanted, which was look up and looked at all the brightest objects, right? The moon, Venus, Jupiter. It was really natural. Mm-hmm. And Cassini, science was already getting started a little bit, and so the scientific method, which basically had started with Galileo, was a little bit on the right road. And
Interesting.
So he was really doing science for the sake of science.
Yeah.
Let me just tell everybody that this is Science Friday from WNYC Studios. So who funded Cassini's work?
So Cassini was an Italian astronomer and scientist, mathematician, and the King Louis the 14th, I believe it was, actually hired him to start up the Paris Observatory, and was kind of his astronomer/astrologer on site. So I think a lot of the funding came from, in fact, the French royalty to actually pay for him to support him through his astrology methods. And then at the same time, he was really getting more and more involved in the astronomy as a result. And ultimately, in the end, sort of didn't really adhere to most of the ideology behind astrology by the end of his career.
Mm-hmm. We only have a few minutes left, so much to talk about. Let me see if I can get a phone call and a tweet. And tweet from Twitter says, when I look at the night sky and see Jupiter, I say a silent thank you for being our guardian and keeping many large objects away from the Earth. I guess that's true too. Let's go to stay right here in Texas. Let's go to Natalie. Hi, Natalie. Welcome to Science Friday.
Oh my gosh! Hi. Thank you for having me.
You're in Del
on.
Rio, right? Welcome
yes.
to Science. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm a 7th grade science teacher. And we were gathering information from a couple of videos that we saw, One Strange Rock. And we were also listening to the news saying how the French scientists have found that Europa has these currents. And my kids kind of combobulate all the information together, and they asked me a really great question. They said, could there possibly be life in Europa? And I said, there could be a possibility of life that we don't know yet.
Okay, good question. That's why we're going there, right? To find out the possibilities.
Absolutely. In fact, that is the one of the main goals. We won't. The life that you would see at Europa is probably under the water, so under the ice shell. But almost everywhere we look at the Earth, we see life where there's water. And in particular, you go to these big, deep vents, thermal vents that are coming out of the deep ocean, and you see it's full of water. Full of life. These things they call black smokers. And in Europa's case, the belief is that water may be in contact with the rock underneath, which is a thermal energy source. And so you might have something very similar to what we have in the deep seas of Earth. And eventually you need a submarine to go in there. But maybe some of the hints will spray out on volcanoes, water volcanoes that spray out, and the spacecraft of Clipper may be able to detect some of the evidence of that.
Sounds like some of our best days are ahead of us in planetary exploration.
And these are the goals of the Europa Clipper mission, to look at how salty is that water, look at if there are these plumes there that we think we've seen, can we fly through them? Can we sense any of the materials that would indicate that there is possibly some sort of hydrothermal activity?
I can't wait. You'll all come back to Science Friday with the results when they happen? Years from now?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And Scott Bolton, principal investigator on the Juno mission, co-investigator on the Cassini mission, Tracy Becker, planetary scientist at the Southwest Research Institute, also where Scott Bolton comes from, and she's co-investigator on the UV instrument on the NASA Europa Clipper mission. Thank you both for this really terrific conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. And next week, we're going to be talking about lightning and all its shapes and sizes, and we want to know what question you have. Let us know what you'd like to know about lightning by downloading the Science Friday Vox Pop app. Tell us what you want to know about lightning. That's Science Friday Vox Pop app, wherever you get your apps. And you asked us your sunscreen questions last week, remember? And we have the answers. Go to sciencefriday.com/sunscreen for the Science on Sunscreen. You can also say hi to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Every day now is Science Friday. I want to thank all the folks here at Texas Public Radio in San Antonio. We'd love to visit your city, and thank you for welcoming us and for taking care of us while we're here. I'm Ira Flato in San Antonio.